The scent of garlic and thyme clung to the air, a comforting ghost that lingered long after the last customer had paid their bill. For Isla Quinn, it was the smell of victory, a small, hard-won victory in the culinary battlefield of Georgetown. It was well past midnight, and the clamor of her restaurant, the Gilded Spoon, had finally subsided into a weary silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of the dishwasher and the low hum of the refrigerators. Isla leaned against a stainless steel counter, the exhaustion a heavy blanket on her shoulders, but it was a satisfying weight. This was hers. Every gleaming pot, every meticulously plated dish, every five-star review taped to the kitchen door. It was all built from her sweat and a dream that tasted of rosemary and browned butter. She pushed a stray strand of auburn hair from her forehead, her gaze sweeping over her small domain. Just one last task. Taking out the trash, a mundane chore to end a magical night. She hefted the heavy black bags, the familiar weight a strange comfort, and headed for the rear exit that opened into the quiet, cobblestoned alley. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the kitchen's oppressive heat. The alley was usually empty at this hour, a silent corridor flanked by the brick backs of historic buildings. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavier, stretched taut like a drumskin. She tossed the bags into the large dumpster, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet, and was about to turn back inside when a sound froze her in place. Tell me, where are you watching from? Does your city hide its own underworld too? Drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe so the Lord knows where you are, and may He bless your soul. A low thud, heavy, wet. It wasn't the sound of a dropped box or a stray cat. It was the sound of a body hitting pavement. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, to lock the door and pretend she'd heard nothing, a morbid curiosity pulled her forward. She crept toward the edge of the doorway, peering into the dimly lit stretch of the alley. Two men stood in the weak glow of a distant street lamp. One was on his knees, hands clutching his chest, his face a mask of pleading terror. The other stood over him, a tall silhouette radiating an aura of absolute control. Isla couldn't hear their words, just the low, menacing rumble of a voice that cut through the night. Then, in a movement that was both unnervingly fluid and brutally efficient, the standing man raised his arm. A glint of metal caught the light. Isla's breath hitched. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a mugging. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. There was no loud bang, just a soft, sickening cough as a silencer did its work. The kneeling man crumpled forward without a sound, his life extinguished in an instant. The killer stood there for a beat, a predator admiring his work, before turning. For a fraction of a second, the light illuminated his face. He was young, handsome in a reckless way, with a jagged scar that cut through his right eyebrow. His eyes, cold and empty, swept the alley, and for one heart-stopping moment, they seemed to lock directly onto the sliver of space where Isla was hiding. A gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it. She threw herself back from the door, her back slamming against the brick wall inside, the rough texture scraping her skin. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized her. She had to call the police. She had to get out. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled with the deadbolt, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot in her ears. She burst out the front door of her restaurant, not bothering to lock it, and sprinted down the empty street, the sound of her own ragged breathing roaring in her head. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She was oblivious to the tiny red light of the new security camera she'd installed above the back door, its unblinking eye having recorded everything. The murder, the face of the killer, and the terrified witness fleeing into the night. Marco De Luca ran his empire from the penthouse of a sleek, anonymous glass tower that pierced the DC skyline. His business was control of the city's ports, its unions, and the silent, invisible currents of power that truly made the capital run. He despised loose ends, and his younger brother Leo was afraid not of them. The call had come at 1:30 a.m., Leo's voice a cocktail of adrenaline and bravado. "I handled him, Marco. That Falcone rat. He won't be a problem anymore." Marco's voice was devoid of emotion. "Where?" "An alley, behind some restaurant in Georgetown." A muscle in Marco's jaw tightened. "Witnesses?" "Nah, it was clean." Marco knew nothing was ever clean with Leo. Within the hour, his men had sanitized the scene, and the security footage from the Gilded Spoon was playing on the massive screen in his office. He watched the grainy footage, his expression unreadable. He saw Leo's reckless violence, and then he saw her. A woman's face in the window, pale with horror. He zoomed in. Isla Quinn, chef and owner, an ordinary citizen, a variable he couldn't control, a fatal liability. The rival Falcone family would pay a king's ransom for her testimony. The police would tear his family apart to get to Leo. He had two options: eliminate the threat or contain it. Killing an innocent civilian was messy. It was loud. It drew the kind of attention he had spent his life avoiding. That left only one viable path: containment, absolute and total. At 2:30 a.m., Isla was pacing the floor of her small apartment, her phone in her trembling hand. Her finger hovered over the 911 icon. Who would she even tell? What would she say? "I think I saw a man get killed." They would think she was crazy, or worse, they would believe her. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from her front door. It wasn't the police. The police announced themselves. This was different. This was the sound of something ending. Her heart leaped into her throat. She crept to the door, her eye pressing against the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his dark eyes radiating a chilling intensity that seemed to burn right through the wood. Flanking him were two mountains of men in dark coats. "Ms. Isla Quinn?" His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, yet it carried an unmistakable threat. "My name is Marco De Luca. I believe we have something to discuss." Isla stumbled back, a silent scream trapped in her throat. He knew her name. How could he know her name? "I have no intention of harming you." Marco's voice drifted through the door, unnervingly serene. "But the people who are looking for you do. The Falcone family. They don't leave witnesses. The police will offer you protection, put you in a safe house, and the Falcones will find you within a week. They always do." He paused, letting the silence press in on her. "I am here to offer you a third option, the only option where you live." The air in her apartment felt thick, suffocating. "What do you want?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "Open the door, Isla, or my men will open it for you. Either way, you are leaving with me tonight." The finality in his tone left no room for negotiation. This wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Her life as she knew it was over. With a shaking hand that felt disconnected from her body, Isla turned the deadbolt. The click was the sound of surrender. The door swung inward, and Marco De Luca stepped into her small, cozy apartment, his presence sucking all the warmth from the room. He was the personification of the danger she had witnessed, a walking embodiment of the city's dark, violent underbelly. His eyes, dark and analytical, swept over her, taking in her terror, her defiance, her utter helplessness. He was not the man from the alley. He was older, colder, more in control. He was the one who pulled the strings. "You have a choice to make," he said, his voice soft, which was somehow more terrifying than if he had yelled. "You can stay here. You can call the police. You can trust a system that is flawed and weak to protect you from men who have no rules. And you will die. Horribly." He took a step closer, and she flinched. "Or," he continued, his gaze pinning her in place, "you can come with me. You will live under my roof, under my rules, under my protection. You will be a ghost, erased from the world you knew, but you will be alive." He stopped directly in front of her. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold, hard power. "So decide, Isla. The police and a shallow grave, or me, and tomorrow." The world Isla Quinn had known, the warm, fragrant chaos of her kitchen, the familiar cobblestones of Georgetown, the simple freedom of walking home under the streetlights, evaporated the moment she stepped across the threshold of her apartment. Marco De Luca did not touch her, yet she felt his presence like a physical force, guiding her out into the cold night and into the back of a black sedan that was as silent and imposing as a hearse. The doors closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her off from her life. She sat rigid on the cold leather, staring straight ahead as the car pulled silently away from the curb. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, painting abstract streaks of gold and crimson against the darkness. It was a world she could see but no longer touch, a life that was no longer hers. Marco sat beside her, a statue carved from shadow and expensive wool. He didn't speak, didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, his mind clearly already on the next move, the next calculation. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a complication, a loose thread that had now been brought under his control. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. It was the silence of a tomb. They drove to a skyscraper that scraped the clouds, a monument of glass and steel that was utterly anonymous. There was no grand entrance, only a discreet underground garage. One of Marco's men, a stoic giant named Luca, led her to a private elevator that required a keycard and a thumbprint scan. The elevator ascended with dizzying speed and silence, opening directly into the penthouse. Isla stepped out, and her breath caught in her throat. The space was immense, a cavern of white marble, chrome, and glass. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window showcasing a breathtaking panoramic view of Washington, D.C. The Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, all the symbols of law and order, were laid out before her like jewels on black velvet. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. The beauty of the place was sharp, cold, and utterly sterile. It wasn't a home. It was a gallery, a showroom. And now, it was her cage. "These are the rules," Marco's voice cut through her daze. He hadn't raised it, but it commanded the entire space. He stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the glittering city. "You will not attempt to leave. The doors are locked. The elevator is coded. The windows do not open more than 2 inches. You will not try to contact anyone. There are no landlines, and your cell phone is gone. Everything you need will be provided for you." He gestured to the silent giant, Luca. "Luca will be stationed outside the main door. He is not here for conversation. Do not test his patience. Do not test mine. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes like chips of obsidian. Do you understand? Isla stared back, a spark of defiance igniting within the terror. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a verbal surrender. She simply lifted her chin, her silence her only weapon. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps a flicker of respect, passed through his eyes. Fine. The bedroom is through there. Food is in the kitchen. Make yourself contained. With that, he turned and left, the elevator doors closing behind him, leaving her alone with Luca's unseen presence on the other side of the door and the suffocating grandeur of her prison. The first 48 hours were a war of attrition waged in silence. Isla refused to eat. It was a childish, futile rebellion, but it was the only one she had. She systematically explored her cage, confirming what Marco had told her. The windows were sealed. The doors were impenetrable. There were books she'd never read, clothes in the closet that weren't her style but fit perfectly, and a bathroom that looked like a spa. It was all meaningless. Twice a day, Luca would enter without knocking, place a tray of expertly prepared food on the marble island in the kitchen, and leave without a word. Twice a day, Isla would watch the food grow cold, her stomach twisting into a tight, aching knot. On the third evening, Marco returned. He saw the untouched trays from the day, saw the dark circles under her eyes and the defiant set of her jaw. He didn't yell or threaten. He did something far worse. He picked up a remote, and the massive television screen on the wall flickered to life with a local news broadcast. Details are still emerging in the shocking murder of a key witness in the federal case against the Falcone crime family, the news anchor said, her expression grim. Alicia Mendez, 28, was gunned down this morning outside the U.S. Marshal's safe house in Arlington. Sources say the attack was a professional hit, raising serious questions about the effectiveness of the witness protection program. Marco turned the television off, plunging the room back into silence. He didn't have to say a word. The message was delivered with the force of a physical blow. That could have been you. That would have been you. Isla sank onto one of the cold leather sofas, the last of her fight draining out of her. He was right. She hated him for it. Hated the twisted logic of this world, but he was right. Her captor was the only reason she was still alive. That night, she ate. The food was tasteless in her mouth, but she forced it down, one bite at a time. It was the taste of survival. With her rebellion crushed, a new, hollow routine began. She would wake up, stare at the city, and try not to think about the life that had been stolen from her. The sprawling penthouse was a void, and she was in danger of being swallowed by it. Then, on the fifth day, she found the kitchen. It wasn't just a kitchen. It was a chef's paradise. A 6-burner Wolf range, sub-zero refrigerators, gleaming copper pots hanging from a rack, and a pantry stocked with ingredients she could only have dreamed of. Truffle oil, saffron threads, aged balsamic, cheeses from every corner of Italy. It was a space designed for creation, for passion. It was the only part of the penthouse that felt alive. She started to cook. At first, it was just for something to do, a way to pass the endless hours. She wasn't cooking for Marco, or even for herself. She was cooking to remember who she was. She kneaded bread until her shoulders ached, the familiar motion a soothing balm. She chopped vegetables with a precision that focused her frantic mind. The kitchen became her sanctuary, the only place in this prison where she was the one in control. The sterile air of the penthouse began to fill with the rich aromas of roasting garlic, simmering tomatoes, and fresh basil. Marco returned late one evening, looking more weary than she had ever seen him. He walked in, stopped dead in the entryway, and inhaled deeply. The scent of her osso buco, a slow braised veal shank she'd been tending to for hours, filled the apartment. It was a scent of home, of warmth, of a life far removed from the cold calculations of his own. He found her in the kitchen, plating the dish with the focused intensity of an artist. For a long moment, he just watched her. When she finally looked up, startled by his presence, her defensive glare was automatic. He ignored it. His eyes were fixed on the plate. "What is that?" "Osso buco," she said, her voice clipped. He walked to the island and sat down, his movements slow. Hila hesitated, then placed the plate in front of him. It felt like a truce, a temporary ceasefire in their silent war. He picked up a fork, cut a piece of the tender meat, and brought it to his lips. And then he froze. The fork hovered in mid-air. His eyes, usually so hard and impenetrable, seemed to look through the walls into a distant past. A profound stillness came over him. "Is something wrong?" Isla asked, an unfamiliar flicker of concern in her voice. He slowly lowered the fork, his gaze unfocused. "My nonna," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper she barely recognized. "My grandmother. She used to make this. Every Sunday." He looked at Isla then, and for the first time, she didn't see a mob boss, a captor, a monster. She saw a man haunted by a memory. She saw a flicker of the boy he must have been, sitting in his grandmother's kitchen, long before this life of violence and power had claimed him. It was the first crack in his armor, a glimpse of the human heart beating beneath the layers of steel. He didn't say another word, but he finished the entire plate. His movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to savor a ghost. That meal changed everything. The silence between them began to fill with words, motivat at first, then more confident. It always started with food. He would ask what she was making. She would explain the process, the history of a dish, the reason for a particular spice. He was a surprisingly attentive listener. One night, as she was meticulously crafting fresh pasta, he leaned against the doorframe, watching her hands work the dough. "The gilded spoon," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Why that name?" Isla didn't stop her work. "My mother used to tell me stories about a magical spoon that could turn any simple meal into a feast. It was her way of saying that love was the most important ingredient." I opened the restaurant in her memory. The confession felt raw, too personal to share with this man, yet it came out anyway. Marco was quiet for a long time. "My family has been in this city for 3 generations, he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "We didn't build our legacy with love. We built it with fear and steel. Sometimes I wonder which is stronger." He left her with that question hanging in the fragrant air. She was his prisoner, a witness he was hiding for his own pragmatic reasons. He was the reason her life was in ruins. And yet, in the heart of this cold, glittering cage, surrounded by danger, Isla Quinn was beginning to realize she wasn't just talking to her captor anymore. She was talking to a man. And that, she knew, was a far more dangerous situation. The kitchen became a fragile sanctuary in the sky, a neutral territory where the stark realities of their situation were temporarily held at bay by the alchemy of heat and flavor. A strange, unspoken domesticity settled into the sterile quiet of the penthouse. Isla cooked, and Marco ate. Their conversations, once limited to monosyllables, began to cautiously unfold, like delicate ferns uncurling in a sliver of unexpected sunlight. He started bringing her things. It began with a rare, leather-bound edition of an Escoffier cookbook he must have seen her eyeing in the penthouse's vast, unread library. Then a small jar of beluga caviar appeared in the refrigerator, followed by a crate of San Marzano tomatoes flown in directly from Italy. They weren't gifts in the traditional sense. There was no warmth in their presentation, no expectation of gratitude. It felt more like a curator procuring the finest materials for his prized, captive artist. Yet it was a sign that he was listening, that in his own cold, calculated way, he was paying attention. Ixtla's internal world was a tempest. A part of her was dangerously lulled by this routine, by the glint of approval in Marco's eyes when he tasted a new dish, by the strange sense of safety she felt within these gilded walls. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had slain the other monsters that hunted her. Then she would catch her reflection in the dark, polished granite of the countertops, a ghost of her former self, a prisoner no matter how luxurious the cage, and a wave of self-loathing would wash over her. The comfort she felt was a betrayal of the life he had stolen, the freedom she had lost. This fragile peace, she knew, was built on a foundation of violence and fear. The foundation shuddered one Tuesday night. Marco was in his office, a glass-walled room off the main living area, reviewing documents on a sleek tablet. Isla was kneading dough for the next morning's focaccia, the rhythmic motion a form of meditation. Luca, the silent guard, entered the penthouse and approached Marco's office, placing a second tablet on the desk before retreating. Isla saw the shift immediately. One moment, Marco was the quiet, thoughtful man who had debated the merits of saffron versus turmeric with her an hour earlier. The next, the boss was back. His entire posture changed, his shoulders squaring, his face hardening into an unreadable mask of granite. The brief warmth that had begun to seep into their interactions was extinguished, replaced by an arctic chill that radiated across the room. After several minutes of tense silence, he looked up, his eyes finding her in the kitchen. "The Falcones paid your old landlord a visit." Isla's hands froze in the dough. "What? Mr. Henderson? Is he okay?" The image of the kind, elderly man who always forgot her rent was due flashed in her mind. "He's fine, scared. They were looking for you, asking questions." Marco's tone was flat, clinical. He was delivering a strategic report, not sharing bad news. "They know your name. They have your picture. They are no longer just hunting a ghost. They are hunting Isla Quinn." A cold dread, more profound than any she had felt since that first night, settled deep in her bones. It wasn't just her life anymore. Her existence was a poison, seeping out and threatening to touch the innocent people she'd left behind. She sank onto a stool, her hands covered in flour, her entire body trembling. "This is my fault," she whispered. "This is their mistake." Marco corrected, his voice dangerously low. He stood and walked to the panoramic window, staring down at the city lights. "They have become impatient, reckless, and now they have reached into a world that is not theirs." He turned to her, and the full force of his contained fury was terrifying to behold. "This is why you are here. Out there, you would be a victim. In here, you are a target, yes, but you are behind a fortress. My fortress." His words were meant to reassure, but they only served to chain her more tightly to him. The gilded cage, which had started to feel suffocating, now felt like the only sanctuary in a world that wanted her dead. Her fear of him was eclipsed by her terror of the Falcones. It was a masterful, unintentional stroke of psychological warfare, and it left her feeling more dependent on her captor than ever. The fragile truce between them was shattered. The easy conversations over dinner vanished, replaced by the old, heavy silence. Isla retreated into herself, the kitchen no longer a sanctuary, but just a room in a prison. Marco was consumed by his war, his presence in the penthouse a whirlwind of hushed, urgent phone calls in Italian and late-night meetings with men whose faces were as hard as his own. She saw the monster again, the ruthless strategist, and she hated herself for ever forgetting what he was. One evening, she couldn't take the silence anymore. He was at the dining table, a spread of tactical maps and surveillance photos laid out where she normally served his dinner. He was planning something. Retaliation. "They broke into my landlord's home," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "So now you're going to break into theirs? Is that how it works? An eye for an eye until everyone is blind and bleeding in the street?" Marco didn't look up from a photograph. "This is not a street fight, Isla. This is a war. It's a series of strategic moves designed to eliminate a threat. My response will not be emotional. It will be precise and overwhelming. And people will die," she shot back, her voice rising. "More people will die because I looked out a window." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were like black ice. "Yes, people will die. The people who are trying to kill you. The people who, if I let them, would torture you for information about my family and then discard your body like garbage." He stood up, walking around the table until he stood directly in front of her. He was so close she could feel the cold anger radiating from him. "You live in a world of fresh ingredients and balanced flavors," he said, his voice a low, brutal whisper. "I live in a world of consequences. In my world, mercy is a weakness that gets people killed. The people I am responsible for. The people under my protection." His gaze was unwavering. "That includes you. My ruthlessness is the only thing keeping you alive. So you can stand there and judge me for it. Or you can accept that the only reason you're breathing right now is because I am better at this ugly game than my enemies are." He left her standing there, his words hanging in the air like poison. He was right, and that was the most horrible part. Her morality, her simple black and white view of the world, was a luxury she could no longer afford. It had no place in this penthouse, no place in his world. She was protected by the very violence she condemned. Defeated, she retreated. But his words had planted a seed. If she was a part of this, whether she wanted to be or not, then being a passive, weeping prisoner was useless. It made her nothing more than a pawn, a liability. A few days later, Marco was in a state of deep frustration. His planned retaliation had been thwarted. The Falcones were smarter than he'd anticipated. They had gone to ground, their operations hidden, their movements unpredictable. He was at his desk, scowling at financial reports from a dozen front companies, searching for a weakness, a pressure point. Isla brought him a cup of coffee, an unspoken peace offering. As she set it down, her eyes drifted over the papers on his desk. It was mostly numbers and legal jargon, but one name on an invoice for a high-end restaurant supply company jumped out at her. "Vittori Imports." "What is it?" Marco asked, noticing her hesitation. "That company—" "Vittori Imports," she said slowly, her mind clicking back to her old life, to the gossip and chatter of the DC culinary scene. "I know them. Everyone in the business does. They supply half the high-end restaurants in the city." Marco's interest was piqued. And they have a reputation," she continued, the pieces falling into place, "for being unreliable. Their fish is never as fresh as they claim. Their truffles are second-rate but sold at a premium. They're always cutting corners to save a buck. She paused, then added the crucial detail. The owner is named Paulie Vittori. He's known for two things: bad seafood and a worse gambling habit. I heard he owes money all over town. Marco leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. Paulie Vittori, are you certain? Positive. He's Sal Falcone's cousin. A slow, predatory smile spread across Marco's face. It was the first genuine smile she had seen in days. A small piece of information, a bit of industry gossip from her former life. But in Marco's world, it was everything. It was the weak link, the loose thread he could pull to unravel the entire Falcone network. He had been looking for a weapon, and she had just handed him one. In that moment, Isla crossed an invisible line. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She wasn't just a prisoner. She had become an asset. She had willingly participated. The shift in the penthouse was immediate. The tension was still there, but now it was electric, purposeful. Marco moved with renewed focus, issuing a series of quiet, precise orders over the phone. He was leveraging her information, setting a trap. The night the operation was set to go down, he found her by the window, watching the city that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The apartment was quiet, the calm before the storm. You were right about Paulie, he said, his voice low. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He was in deep with a bookie who works for me. He was more than happy to trade information about his cousin's shipments to clear his debts. So it's happening tonight, she stated, her voice flat. Yes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek burner phone, pressing it into her hand. Her fingers automatically closed around the cold plastic. If I am not back by sunrise, he said, his voice devoid of any drama, Luca has his instructions. He will drive you out of the city, to a private airfield. This phone is for you to use only then. There is one number in it. The man who answers will give you a new name, a new life. Everything will be arranged. Isla stared at him, her heart pounding. This was his contingency plan, a plan for his own death. I will keep my promise, Isla, he continued, his gaze intense. One way or another, you will be safe. He turned to leave, his men waiting for him by the elevator. Marco, she called out, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, his hand on the door, and looked back at her. Come back, she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He gave her a single, sharp nod, and then he was gone. Isla stood alone in the vast, silent penthouse, the burner phone a cold, heavy weight in her hand. She walked to the window and watched as a convoy of black cars pulled out of the garage below and disappeared into the city's glittering veins. She was no longer just a witness to a single crime. She was now an accomplice in a war. And her survival, her future, was tied to the fate of the ruthless, complicated man who had just walked out into the night. All she could do was watch the sky and wait for the dawn. The silence in the penthouse was a living entity. It breathed in the hushed hum of the climate control and exhaled in the distant, mournful wail of a siren slicing through the Washington, D.C. night. Isla sat on a low white sofa, the burner phone a cold, alien object in her palm. For hours she had remained motionless, her entire being focused on the vast, glittering expanse of the city beyond the glass wall. Every flicker of headlights on the distant freeway, every shadow that moved in the streets below, was a potential omen of a future she couldn't bear to imagine. The man she had once seen as a monster was out there, in the violent heart of the world he commanded. And she, the unwilling witness, was praying for him. The realization was a dizzying, sickening lurch in her gut. She was hoping for a criminal to triumph in a war of shadows, for his violence to be more effective than his enemies. She was hoping for the survival of the man who had dismantled her life, piece by piece, and rebuilt it into this strange, precarious existence. What did that make her? The line between right and wrong, once so clear and defined in the warm, simple world of her kitchen, had blurred into an indistinguishable gray. She thought of her old life, the long hours, the constant worry about bills, the quiet loneliness of her small apartment. It was a good life, an honest one. But was it? Connor's betrayal had proven that even her simple world held its own hidden poisons. Marco had never lied to her. He had been brutally, terrifyingly honest from the very beginning. His darkness was a known quantity, a declared threat. It was a strange and twisted foundation, but it was the only foundation she had left. The first hint of dawn bled across the horizon, a bruised purple softening to a pale, hopeful rose. Sunrise. The deadline he had set. Her heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm for hours, sank into a cold, heavy stillness. He wasn't coming back. The thought was not accompanied by relief or a sense of freedom. It was a hollow, desolate ache. Her thumb stroked the smooth surface of the burner phone. One call, a new name, a new life, an escape. She could walk away from all of this, from the bloodshed and the fear. She could disappear and try to piece together the shattered remnants of Isla Quinn. She lifted the phone, her finger hovering over the single call button. It was a choice, a real choice. Run towards a life of solitary, haunted freedom, or stay and face the wreckage of a life built with a ghost. A soft, whirring sound cut through the silence. She froze, her head snapping towards the private elevator. It was ascending. Her breath caught in her throat, a knot of hope and fear so tight it was painful. Was it Luca, coming to enact the contingency plan? Or was it him? The elevator doors slid open with a whisper. Marco stood there. He was not the immaculate, controlled man who had left hours before. His bespoke suit was rumpled and torn at the shoulder. A dark, ugly bruise was blooming high on his cheekbone, and a shallow cut on his jaw was still weeping a thin line of blood. His face was a canvas of profound exhaustion, but his eyes, when they found hers across the expansive room, were blazing with a fierce, possessive light. He looked like a king who had just walked through fire to reclaim his throne. "It's done," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The Falcones. They're finished." The burner phone slipped from Isla's numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. A wave of relief so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her, and she had to grip the edge of the sofa to keep from collapsing. She couldn't speak, could only nod, a flood of unshed tears burning behind her eyes. Marco's gaze dropped to the phone lying between them. "You didn't call," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I was waiting for you," she whispered, and the words were a confession, an oath of fealty she hadn't even known she was willing to make. She had chosen. In the long, dark hours of the night, she had chosen her side. She had chosen him. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the exhaustion falling away, replaced by an urgent intensity. He stopped in front of her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were now streaming down her cheeks. He wasn't just looking at her. He was memorizing her, confirming she was real, that she was safe, that she was still here. You waited, he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of the cold night, of gunpowder and victory clung to him. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it was the most reassuring scent in the world. The days that followed were a blur of quiet consolidation. The war was over, but the business of power continued. Marco was a constant presence, no longer a ghost in his own home. He worked from his office, taking calls, holding meetings, his voice the calm, authoritative center of a web of operations that spanned the city. But now, Isla saw it from the inside. She saw the loyalty his men had for him. She saw him arrange for the families of the men he'd lost in the firefight to be taken care of for life. She saw the brutal pragmatism, but she also saw the harsh code of honor that governed his world. He dealt with Leo swiftly. His younger brother, the cause of all this, was brought to the penthouse. There was no shouting, just a low, cold conversation in Marco's office that Isla could not hear, but whose outcome she saw clearly. Leo emerged an hour later, his face pale and stripped of its usual arrogance. He was exiled, sent to manage a legitimate shipping business in Italy, far from the trouble he could cause. Marco's loyalty to his family was absolute but not unconditional. He had cut out the cancer to save the body. With the external threats removed, a new, more terrifying question emerged in the silence between them. What now? The premise of her captivity, her protection, was gone. She was, for all intents and purposes, free. But the invisible chains that now bound her to him were stronger than any locked door. A month after that long night, a fragile sense of normalcy had taken root. Isla had brought life into the cold penthouse. An herb garden flourished on the balcony. A warm cashmere throw was draped over the cold leather sofa. The scent of baking bread now permanently overpowered the sterile scent of glass cleaner. It was beginning to look like a home. One evening, Marco came to her as she stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and violet. He didn't stand beside her. Instead, he placed two objects on the marble table behind her. A passport with a new name and a pristine photograph of her she didn't remember taking. Beside it, a bank card linked to an account with a balance that would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. And next to that, a single, simple key. The key to the penthouse. "The threat is gone, Isla," he said quietly, his voice resonating with a strange formality. "Truly gone. You can take that passport and that card, and you can walk out of that elevator and never look back. I will give you my word, I will never look for you. You can have a life of peace, a normal life." She turned from the window to look at him. His face was serious, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. He gestured to the single key. "Or, you can stay. Not as my witness, not as my prisoner, not as an asset." He took a step towards her, his voice dropping, becoming raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Stay as my partner, my equal, in this house, in this life." Isla looked at the objects on the table. Path A, freedom, safety, anonymity, a chance to be the old Isla Quinn again. Path B, a key to a gilded cage that had become a sanctuary, a life entwined with the city's most dangerous man. She thought of her restaurant, of the simple joy she had felt. And she realized that joy was fragile, built on an illusion of safety that one stray glance into an alleyway had shattered forever. Her old life wasn't waiting for her. It was a ghost. It had vanished the moment Marco De Luca walked through her door. This dangerous, complicated, intense world was the only real thing she had left. For the first time in her life, She felt seen, protected, and fiercely, terrifyingly alive. She walked past the table, past the offer of a safe escape, and stopped directly in front of him. "My old life is gone, Marco," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It died in an alley in Georgetown." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "This is my life now." She looked directly into his dark, waiting eyes. "If you'll have me." A slow, profound relief washed over his features, erasing the lines of tension and uncertainty. He covered her hand with his own, his grip strong and sure. "Aisla," he breathed, her name both a question and an answer. He bent his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of acceptance, a silent, binding contract. It was the sealing of a choice made in the crucible of fear and violence. Later that night, they stood together at the panoramic window, the city sprawling beneath them, a kingdom of glittering lights. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She was no longer looking out at a world she was locked away from. She was looking out at a world that was now hers to navigate, with him as her guide and her shield. "Everything you see," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It's ours now. And I swear on my life, Aisla, I will burn all of it to the ground before I let anyone ever hurt you again." She leaned back into his embrace, a feeling of profound and terrifying peace settling over her. It was not the life she would have chosen. It was not a life of simple goodness or easy morality, but it was real. And as she watched the endless river of headlights flow through the heart of the nation's capital, she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was finally home.